All right, what I'm going to tell you is not going to improve your life at all. I'm going to try to enlighten you. And enlightenment is a destructive process. It does not make your life better. It makes your life worse. This civilization, like every civilization, is based on endemic racism, endemic misogyny, and tremendous economic disparity. These are just part of the system that we don't even question. We just take for granted without even thinking about them. Next slide. And it's working out great. Here we are, post-apocalyptic planet. This is what most places on the planet look like these days. It's working out great. As the anarchist Kropotkin pointed out in his 1906 book, all civilized life becomes one huge lie. My favorite pronunciation, civilization. The whole thing is a series of lies, just like in the previous slide. All those things go unquestioned. They're all wrong. And consistent with the notion that hope is unimpeachably good, we have Farley Mowat's quote, we're under some gross misconception that we're a good species going somewhere important at the last minute, we'll correct our errors and God will smile on us. It's delusion. Not only is it delusion, but the last minute was about 100 years ago, or maybe 10,000. The last minute was a long time ago, the point at which we could have made changes that would have made a difference for the continued persistence of our species and many others on the planet. That passed, we left that train station a long time ago. Consider, for example, here's the headline from the Associated Press, late June 1989. When I was teaching college at the University of Arizona, some of my students hadn't been born yet, when Noel Brown pointed out that governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. Well, it looks like the statement made more than 27 years ago indicates that we had 10 years, 17 years ago. Time's up. Every other person speaking on the topic of climate change will tell you that there are things we need to do right now. In fact, my co-host on the radio show, Mike Sleva, almost every episode will be chatting along and he'll say, yeah, but if we start right now, because that's what I've heard my whole life. We didn't start right now last week. We didn't start 10 years ago. We didn't start 27 years ago. We never started. Because civilization is based on this series of lies. In response, here we are. I thought of this just not more than about 3 hours ago when I was walking in the door to this place, and that was me right there. And I bump into somebody, excuse you, Jesus, will you get out of my way? Doing important work here, looking at my smartphone. Next. Shortly after Noel Brown made that statement, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases points out in October of 1990 that 1 degree Celsius is the absolute upper limit we cannot cross. 1 degree Celsius above baseline, meaning the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or 1750. Or beyond that now. You constantly hear that 2 degrees is the scientific target. It's not. That's a political target. And when self-respecting climate change scientists, such as Michael Mann, adhere to the 2 degree target, they're quoting an economist, of all things, the dismal science, and I think that's generous to call it a science. They're quoting William Nordhaus, who came up with the 2 degree target out of thin air. 1 degree is the absolute upper limit beyond which we could not cross, or we're going to trigger these self-reinforcing feedback loops that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage, like massive droughts all over the world, like massive floods all over the world, like hurricanes that come along, a millennial year hurricane that we have every year now, and we don't really think much about it. Next. Loss of habitat will cause human extinction, because we're human animals. And like other animals, we need habitat to survive. That habitat is comprised mostly of those things I mentioned earlier that we monetize: food, water, and air. And without them, like every other species on the planet, we go extinct. It's relatively simple, actually. We're animals, we need habitat to survive. We're destroying every other species on the planet. You think that's not going to affect us? So we're starting to see accumulating evidence in the referee journal literature that we can't go on like this. But at some point, these livestock did not die because it was hot. They did not die because it was dry. The rancher had stock tanks filled with water that they could drink out of. They died because they didn't have food. And as it turns out, I get really hungry and cranky when I don't have food. And at some point, we're going to look like this without food. And we're headed there now. There's a lot of people on this planet who don't have daily access to food, who, I suspect, unlike everybody in this room, wake up every single day wondering if they're going to be starving again today. Next. I'd like to play a short clip here. It's 4 minutes long. It's from November 2014, the second of 3 seasons from an HBO program called The Newsroom. I'd like to play it, but I won't. Because technology rocks. On the rare occasion it actually works. So I'm going to describe to you what happens in this episode. It's not quite as good as the real thing. The news anchor interviews an EPA scientist who has a master's degree in biology and two PhDs, one in climate science. And two critical points in the episode. One, the anchor asks, what does all this look like? Talking about things that are likely to happen in the future. And the expert describes 6 events that fall into the category of what does this look like? And I'm going to describe how they are all underway already. So that's what I'm going to do with the next 6 or 7 slides. And then another question the news anchor asks this EPA employee, are you going to get in trouble for saying this? And the expert says, who cares? So most people care. Most people who are employed in governmental or academic institutions care about what they say. Because there is no mainstream climate scientist who will say that I'm saying. There's a reason for that. They would not be supported in their jobs if they said what I'm saying. In the clip, the expert talks about the 80-foot rise in sea level that is locked in based on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already. That was when there's 385 parts per million CO2. There's no more than 400 parts per million CO2. And so there's a 80-foot sea level rise already locked in. And he failed to mention there's a 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise locked in as well. Next. That's based on carbon dioxide alone. He talks about mass migrations as if they're something for the future, as if they aren't already going on in huge numbers all over the planet. If you used to live in one of the 5 Solomon Islands that's now underwater, you lost habitat. You know what that means. People all over the world are losing habitat right now. There are 4 billion people on the planet who don't have access to daily water. 4 billion, that's more than half. Next. Food and water shortages he mentioned, and food shortages and water shortages are happening all over the world. We're currently having Olympic Games in a place that the swimmers are forced to submerge themselves in water that is not recommended that humans put their heads under because it's contaminated so badly. And this is the Olympics. And we're pouring an enormous amount of money into the Olympics. You can imagine what it's like for the people on the street. Next. Running out of water is kind of a big deal. Next. Spread of deadly disease. This is something I talked about with respect to climate change in my undergraduate courses 15 or 20 years ago as the kinds of things we would be seeing in the future, and we're already seeing them. This is from a few days ago at Think Progress. And the headline at Bloomberg is correct. Anthrax spewing zombie deer are the least of your warming planet worries. Those things are almost certainly not going to kill you. But loss of habitat will. Next. Fires. He talks about epic fires that are way too many and too large to control. And we're there. Oh, the irony. When in Alberta, in the heart of the tar sands area, Fort McMurray is threatened by a fire. There is, as even CNBC points out via headline, there's a new era of super fires that we're facing. Last year, the United States saw the most acres burned since records have been kept. The current fire season is not over yet. Next. And of course, superstorms. Like Katrina was a big deal in 2005. And then we have one every year for the last 4 years. We have a similar superstorm. These are 100-year or 1,000-year events. And they're every year. That's inconvenient. Next. Who cares? Yes, who cares? Well, I was radicalized a long time ago, and I was taking a radical approach in my classrooms. Radical here, I'm using the actual definition of the word, which is to get to the root. We have been coerced by this culture into believing that radical means extremist. Radical means to get to the root. That's why that little square root sign, that when you put it over a 4, it means, oh, the answer is 2. You know what that little square root sign is called? It's called a radical, because it gets to the root. So I was a heavily award-winning faculty member, and next slide, I had an NSA contract to spy in my classroom as early as 2005, perhaps earlier than that. My final department head was hired between here as well. January 2007, her first administrative act was to ban me from teaching in my home department because she knew I loved to teach. She was a former friend and mentor of mine. Next. Tim Garrett wrote a paper in 2007. It was published in Climatic Change. He pointed out that only collapse of civilization prevents runaway climate change. The paper was written in 2007. It was published electronically in November 2009 by a very brave editor named Stephen Schneider, made doubly brave at that time in his life because he was almost dead. The paper was pulled immediately because there was an outcry from the scientific community. No, we can't talk about collapse of civilization. It was withdrawn from publication. It didn't appear in print form until February 2011, when 2 research groups had developed time to respond to the paper. So their published responses were allowed in the same issue. Garrett was not allowed to respond to those comments. He subsequently published 2 additional papers, at least 2, pointing out that civilization itself is a heat engine. Civilization is a heat engine. Think about that. If you're on it with solar panels and wave power and wind turbines, it's still a heat engine. Only turning off the heat engine that is civilization prevents runaway climate change. Well, now we know, years later, based on research by James Hansen and colleagues in late 2011 and others subsequently, that turning off the heat engine leads to up to a 3 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise almost immediately after the heat engine of civilization is terminated. 3 degrees is a big deal, as we'll see. Next. Already, agriculture, or civilization, is on the brink. The title in Truth Out from April of this year is Agriculture is on the Brink. And agriculture, or the growing of grains at scale, is what typifies civilizations. All civilizations have had the ability to store food, and most notably to store grains. That's how we monetize the food. Daniel Quinn's definition of civilization, one of his definitions is they lock up the food. By locking up the food, we control the food and therefore the people. That's what civilization is. That's what civilization does. Civilization is on the brink. Agriculture is on the brink at 1.5 degrees Celsius above baseline. A little more warming, civilization's over, not because of anything going on in the financial markets, but because we can't grow food at scale. Next. There are consequences associated with the collapse of civilization, just as there are consequences associated with retaining civilization. I mentioned a few at the beginning, the consequences of retaining civilization: inherent misogyny, inherent widespread racism, and so on. But in addition to those, there's 150 to 200 species a day that are driven to extinction. as reported by the United Nations in August 2010. But there are consequences associated with shutting down civilization, too. The Daily Impact gets it right just about a week or so ago. Technology is now cancer, stage 4 metastasized. Among the consequences of shutting down civilization, of turning off the heat from the heat engine, are, for example, the 1,200 spent fuel rods that have spent nuclear fuel suddenly exposed to the air and explode into fires, the likes of which this planet has never seen. Somebody commented on one of my presentations when it showed up on YouTube, that's not a spent fuel rod fire. There's a reason I say the likes of which this planet has never seen, because we've never had one of those fires. We've never had spent fuel rods exposed to the atmosphere and explode into flame. We don't even know what that looks like, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be good. And it would be spewing ionizing radiation all over the planet. There's 1,200 of those spent fuel rod pools in places like Fukushima. And shutting down civilization, as I already mentioned, eliminates the global dimming associated with putting particulates in the sky. So not only are we putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that serve as a blanket to hold the heat down, we're also putting particulates, notably aerosols, associated with burning poor quality coal. And they serve as an umbrella to bounce the radiation back out. We take that away, and the planet warms up very, very quickly. Almost certainly beyond the point at which humans have inhabited the planet at any time in our 5 million year run on the planet. Next. Who cares? Well, it seemed like Natalia Shikova and her colleagues didn't care at one point. In the Geophysical Research Abstracts of the European Geophysical Union in 2008, they wrote, we consider release up to 50 gigatons of hydrate storage, this from the relatively shallow seabed in the Arctic Ocean, as highly possible for abrupt release at any time, and they concluded that that would warm the planet by about 1.3 degrees Celsius in approximately the year it takes for CH4 or methane to circulate the globe. So in 2008, they actually wrote this. And then in 2013, in an interview associated with the release of a refereed journal article, Shikova repeated the claim. And then, next slide, in 2015, about 2 years after the previous interview, she said, we never stated that 50 gigatons is likely to be released in near or distant future. Really? By never, do you mean in 2008? When this, and this is still in print, by the way. When I say I prefer the pronunciation civilization, it's for reasons like this. And that's one of 6 and change self-reinforcing feedback loops. The release of methane from the Arctic Ocean, according to a paper in Global Policy, is one of a suite of several, of numerous, of many, I don't know how many terms I can put in there, of feedback mechanisms such as massive methane release from the subsea Arctic Ocean that have been engaged. It's done. It's game over. The NASA's CARVE project found methane plumes up to 150 kilometers across based on actual observations from satellites. That in the summer of 2013. The U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, in their analysis several years ago, predicts an ice-free Arctic Ocean in 2016. That's this year, plus or minus 3 years. And what we're seeing right now is exceptionally thin ice in the Arctic Ocean, what remains of the ice. So we could see an ice-free Arctic Ocean this September. It wouldn't surprise me either way at this point. But certainly within a year or 2 or 3 years down the road, we're going to see an ice-free Arctic Ocean. And then I pretty much guarantee we're going to have that 50 gigaton, the first 50 gigaton burst of methane that Natalia Shikova predicted wouldn't, or never stated would happen, ever, at any time. Next. Jason Box is a relatively young climate scientist. He's a glaciologist. He was at Ohio State University where he received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. He was a faculty member there, and he became frustrated with the censorship that was going on at that institution. So he joined Camille Parmesan, who left the University of Texas for the same reason. She went to England. He went to Copenhagen and started working as a climate scientist there. And just a couple of years ago, he said, even if a small fraction of the Arctic Ocean were released to the atmosphere, we're effed. That's a direct quote from 2 years ago. And then, next slide. A month ago, he said, all we really know is that the risk is high. I think for right now we need to try to remain calm. I have this wonderful little 32-second video clip here. The guy who's in the shadow comes out. It came out in the Siberian Times, and online, if you go to this article, you can go to the little embedded video clip and play it all by yourself at home. And it shows this guy who we only see the shadow come out, and he starts pushing this area with his boot, and it's like it's a grassland in Siberia, and it used to be underlain by permafrost, and it looks like jello. So he's just stomping on it with his boot, and it's actually wavy, it's wiggly, it looks like a trampoline or something. And then he kicks his heel into it, and you can hear the gas going psh. So 3 days after Remain Calm, we have an example of terrestrial permafrost leaking methane so loud we can hear it in a windstorm. I think it would be good to remain calm. Next. Gerardo Ceballos was the lead author on a paper that came out last year and finally concluded 5 years after the United Nations concluded that we were driving to extinction 150 to 200 species every day. Finally, 5 years later, the academic uber-conservative community concludes in a referee journal article in Science Advances with a headline that we are entering the sixth mass extinction. Finally, they conclude we're in the midst of a mass extinction event, the sixth one in the history of the planet. Mass extinction means that at least 50% of the species are going to go extinct or have gone extinct in the past. There have been 5 previous mass extinction events, and at least 16 relatively minor extinction events in which 25% or more of species go extinct, which is only minor if you're, not one of them. Ceballos says life would take many millions of years to recover. This is in an interview that came out the same day as this paper. And our species itself would likely disappear early on. What does it take to get a standing ovation around here? Next. Who cares? I don't think Sam Carana cares about his career, or hers. We don't know who Sam Carana is. Based on somebody I consider a reliable personal source, it's 2 or 3 people. Based on email exchanges and when they're working, Sam Carana lives in Western Europe and on the East Coast of the United States and maybe on the West Coast of the United States too. So we'll say there's 2.5 Sam Caranas, and they're as prolific as 2.5 of me, for damn sure. And he pointed out about a month ago at the Arctic News blog with headline, a global temperature rise of more than 10 degrees Celsius by 2026. That's 10 degrees above baseline. When the rise occurs quickly, as it did, say, 252 million years ago, it produces an event called the Great Dying. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were at about 13.5 degrees Celsius. So we came out of the Ice Age about 12,000 years ago. Temperature rose to about 13.5 degrees Celsius. That allowed us to grow grains at scale, not only because it was warmer than it had been, but because the temperature stabilized for a long period of time, for a few thousand years. During that few thousand years, civilizations arose, several of them, 6 or so, all over the planet. Because now we can grow grains in the interior of large continents, most notably in the northern hemisphere, so we can store food. That's all a result of a 1.5 degree rise in global average temperature, and then stability at that point. We've had humans, well, for not very long. This is all humans. I'm not talking about our favorite species, Homo sapiens, the wise ape. And so I was showing the extreme version. The more likely version is that humans persisted in this range, and we're right here. We're right here. Like every other species, we need habitat to survive. So far, that habitat has been found in this little tiny window. And we're headed for, according to Sam Carana's analysis, we're headed to right here. Right on the snout of this little a shrew-looking thing. That's the temperature we're headed for. Next. I'm going to go through that a little bit while pointing out that according to a headline in The Guardian 8 years ago, on a planet 4C hotter, and that means 4 degrees Celsius above baseline, all we can plan for is extinction. And the paper by Oliver Tickell goes on to explain that that's not really what he means. What he really means is that 5 or 6 degrees above baseline we're screwed. But at some point, we're in bad shape. So 5 or 6 above baseline would take it right up there. It's difficult for me to imagine humans on the planet at that point, but maybe. So I'm going to look at Sam Carana's analysis from a month ago, in which he ponders a 10.02 degree potential global average temperature rise by 2026. So I'm going to subtract 1.3 from this one, I subtract 0.5 from this one, and stick with the conservative numbers otherwise. And that takes me to 8.21 degrees Celsius, not the 10.02 that Carana gets. So let's take a look at what that looks like on the graph next. So that's this yellow line right here. So within 10 years, that takes us from here today to gone tomorrow. Oh, no, it doesn't say that.